Okay, good afternoon. I hope you are all well. We're going to today do what we can with the 20th century, and I've selected three styles: Cubism, Expressionism, and Futurism to show you. And I hope you've had a chance to take a look at the films that I sent out. I'll be sending out more films as well. And by the way, next week we will have a review for the final exam. And as I said, the final exam will be open book, open note. You may use anything that you want. It will just be essay questions. There will be no slide identification questions. And while we will review, I would suggest that you go back to the original lectures to write your essays, because there will, of course, be more material in them as well. So, as you can see, we're going to talk about Cubism today with Picasso, and we're going to talk about, um, oh, before we do that, in order to do the required attendance report, please do send me an email with your full name in the subject line and include the number, which I will provide later on during the course of the lecture to you during the lecture. So we're going to talk about Cubism with Picasso today, German Expressionism with Ernst Ludwig Kepner, Franz Marc, and Kater Kollwitz, and very briefly we'll talk about Futurism as well with Boccioni. I hope you have your syllabus with you, and please do check Cubism and Picasso. Also analytical cubism and synthetic cubism, the two substyles of cubism, which we will talk about in a few minutes, and put a check, please, in front of the style Expressionism and Kirchner and Kollwitz as well. So let's begin with Cubism, which was an essentially intellectual art. It's a very cerebral art form. I'm sure it's very difficult for you to discern anything from the real world in this particular piece, which is entitled Majoli. And I'll tell you what the subject matter is and translate the title for you in just a couple of minutes. But first of all, I do want to give you an overview of Cubism as a style. There are two styles of Cubism. First of all, analytical Cubism, and that was evident from approximately 1907 to about 1911 or so. The word analytical, as you know, is an adjective derived from the word analysis. And so what Picasso and his colleagues, including Braque, did during this period is they, as the term implies, analyzed the objects. That is, they broke it down into its essential geometrical components. Sometimes this stage of Cubism is referred to as the Cézannesque phase, because you may recall when we talked, albeit briefly, about Cézanne, he made the statement that all of nature should be seen in terms of the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder. Now, believe it or not, Cubism is a form of naturalism. Obviously not naturalism in the sense of the way the Renaissance approached naturalism, but naturalism in the sense that Picasso said he was trying to show the object as it really is rather than as it appears to be. So therefore, he did away with traditional perspective, by which I mean linear and aerial perspective. Whenever I teach Cubism in a classroom, I always ask people to engage in kind of a simplistic exercise, which I suppose you can do at home as well. That is, look at any object in the room. And depending on where you're seated, you might see one angle of it, you might see two. You know, however, that it has multiple viewpoints, and that's precisely what Picasso was interested in the analytical stage of Cubism. That is, on the one hand, as I just said, breaking down the object into its essential geometrical components, and then showing it from all angles at the same time. The phrase that he used was simultaneity of viewpoint. Now, believe it or not, what you see or don't see in this particular piece is a human figure. Majoli means a beautiful, my beautiful one, so it's supposed to be a representation of a female figure. If you take a look down at the lower right, you might see some fingers. If you take a look at the lower left, just above the title of the piece, you might see what perhaps looks like an arm, an elbow. You can see a musical term as well above the word jolie and just to the right. If you take a look at the upper area of the compositional configuration, you might be able to see some semblance of facial features. So if you superimpose a kind of a triangular configuration over this piece, you might be able to see a figure. But it's very hard to discern, is it not? Because the figure is very closely related to the ground. He is showing you all angles at the same time. So therefore, around 1911, Picasso reached an impasse, and he believed that he had gone too far and he had violated what he originally set out to do, that is, show the object from all angles at the same time in a form of naturalism. So therefore, the Cubist embarked on the second phase of Cubism, which is called synthetic Cubism. And that adjective, pardon me, is derived from the noun synthesis, as in putting together. So what they did, according to George Braque, they tried to represent not the object, but the new unity, and that's a direct quote. This involves collage. So they would take pieces of wallpaper, they'd take a musical score, put it together in such a way that it began to take on a reference to an object from the natural world. And Picasso being Picasso, and he was, by the way, a Spaniard, as perhaps you know, very often that object was a guitar. So that's the overview of Cubism. On the one hand, it is a form of naturalism. There are two sub-styles of Cubism: analytical Cubism from about 1907 to 1911, in which they broke down the object into its essential geometrical components, showing it from all angles at the same time, eventually intrinsically integrating figure and ground, that is the object, with the surrounding space. Then around 1911, and this second stage of Cubism, that is synthetic Cubism, was much shorter. It lasted only about a year or so. They used collage. They began to put various objects together in such a way that they took on a reference, pardon me, to an object from the natural world. So folks, I'll tell you right now that in terms of the final exam, you're going to meet up with a question on Cubism. And please do have an understanding of the basic concepts of Cubism, which I just articulated for you, and also have an understanding of the two phases of Cubism, that is, analytical Cubism and synthetic Cubism. So let's go on. I want to show you the progression that Picasso took. This is much earlier. This is from his so-called blue period, as you probably know, around the turn of the 20th century. And you are not going to be burdened with remembering the blue period, but as I said, I want to show you his evolution. There are a lot of really silly things that have been said about Picasso's blue period. And one of, I think, the silliest is the point of view from one quote-unquote scholar that the reason that he engaged in the blue period is because he was very poor. He couldn't afford to buy much in the way of paint supplies, and he supposedly relied solely on blue paint. That's absurd, particularly because of the fact that at least at that point in time, I don't know if this is the case today as well, but at that point in time, what blue paint was comprised of, at least in part, was ground up lapis lazuli, which is a semi-precious material. So it was in fact more expensive at that point in time than other colors were. The real reasons, really plural, for Picasso's blue period. Number one, the cultural milieu, the ambience of the time period. The end of the 19th century, the so-called decadence. We talked about this last week when we discussed the work of Van Gogh. Night Cafe at Arles, the sense of alienation, lack of communication. And the end of the 19th century was in many respects a very difficult time period. The other reason was purely personal. Picasso had a very close friend who committed suicide as a result of a love affair gone bad. So those likely are the two reasons for the so-called blue period that he engaged in at the beginning of the 20th century. Then his mood lightened a little bit later on. This is called the family of acrobats. It is from the so-called rose period for obvious reasons. Now, you know, he's obviously looking at Paul Cézanne at this point in time. It's not accurate to refer to the forms in this painting as cubist yet, but it is accurate to refer to them as cubic. And remember, if you would, that Cezanne stated all of nature should be seen in terms of the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder, that is, intrinsic geometrical forms. The figure at the far left is Harlequin, and traditional French clown, and the costume that he wears is the one that Picasso has painted. Again, it's based obviously on geometrical forms. Probably Picasso chose to include Harlequin in this image because, in fact, he was becoming very interested in investigating geometrical forms. This is also from the Rose period. It is his portrait of Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was actually an American expatriate. She was a literary figure from a very wealthy family. And she moved to Paris, became part and parcel of the avant-garde in Paris, which was comprised not only of visual artists, but also literary figures as well. Good story behind this particular painting. Picasso was having a lot of difficulty with it. She sat for him 50, that's 50 times, and he couldn't get it right. She was getting frustrated. He was getting frustrated. He went back home to Spain for a while, and he took a look at some traditional Spanish sculpture there. And that gave him sort of the inspiration and the impetus to finish this particular piece, which he did. And if the forms, particularly in her face, do look rather sculptural, that is the reason. This piece is very important, folks. It is considered to be the first Cubist painting. It was done in 1907. It's entitled Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which translates from the French as The Young Women of Avignon. And by the way, it's unfinished, and there is some suggestion that Picasso himself didn't really like the piece. Certainly his colleagues did not like the work. George Braque said, "You may give us all the explanations you like, but your painting makes me feel as if you were trying to get us to eat cotton waste and wash it down with kerosene," quote unquote. It is a highly cerebral work of art. It's a very intellectual work of art. And again, his colleagues were baffled by it. They had no idea what he was trying to do with it. But what he was doing with it was engaging in nascent cubism. As I said, this is the first piece that is considered to be a Cubist work of art. I want to talk first of all about some of the influences on him, and they are threefold. Number one, Cezanne. All of nature should be seen in terms of the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder. Obviously, the geometrical forms with which he has dealt with these various figures. The other major influence, if you take a look at the two figures on the far right, their faces are African masks. Now, I may have mentioned to you when we talked about Impressionism and Post-Impressionism that those artists were highly influenced by Japanese art. They were. At the beginning of the 20th century, in terms of Western artists, the influence of Japan sort of waned, and they became very interested in African art, African tribal art, not the art of the kingdoms. They are very, very different in terms of formal elements. But nonetheless, the two figures on the right are obviously derived from African masks. The figure at the far left is derived from ancient Egyptian art. So if you take a look at the face, you see the face itself in profile, but the eye is depicted as if you were looking at it frontally. And certainly, again, the very architectonic, very geometrical forms of that figure are reference ancient Egyptian art. So those are the three influences that we're working on him very strongly here. Let's take a look at this piece in terms of how it is, in fact, Cubist. And I direct your attention to the figure at the far right, the lower right. And if you take a look at the face, you can make a case that you were looking at it in profile as well as frontally. And the body of the figure is seen from the back. So this is the beginning of what Picasso made reference to as simultaneity of viewpoint. That is, looking at an object from all angles at the same time. And take a look, if you would, too, at what you understand to be, in quotes, negative space. It's not negative. It's not empty. But rather, space has acquired form. And the space is defined in terms of the same geometrical shapes that define the figures themselves. So this, as I said, is a very important work of art. You might put a check in front of it, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, considered to be the first Cubist painting. This is a sketch for the painting that you just saw. And you can see that, well, let me tell you what this was supposed to depict. The interior of a brothel, and the figure in the center was supposed to be a man. He's surrounded by the various prostitutes. If you take a look at the far left, there's another male figure coming in, holding an object under his arm. And that object, pardon me, had the painting been completed the way he originally intended, it would have been a skull. So the theme of this particular piece originally was supposed to be the ubiquitous, that is the ever-present um, uh, fact of death coming into an area of, in quotes, pleasure, at least from the point of view of the male client in the center. But he changed it, and as you can see, he eliminated the male figure in the center. He turned the male figure in the far left into a female figure, eliminated the skull as well. So had he done it in the way that he originally intended, it would have been typical of the types of themes that were portrayed at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that is death, despair, alienation. But instead, he turned it into the first Cubist painting. So as I said, folks, please do put a check in front of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Let me show you his progression. This is called Woman with Pears, and it was made in 1909, 2 years after Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. If you take a look at the still life in the background, that's just pulled right out of Paul Cézanne, is it not? So again, all of nature should be seen in terms of the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder. These are all analytical Cubist works. We haven't gotten to synthetic Cubism yet. But I draw your attention, please, to the way that he has defined the forehead of this figure. He's beginning to break it open. Now, if you've ever done portraits, particularly in sculpture, you will know that the human forehead has essentially three planes. Picasso knows that as well, but he's obviously opened it up. That is, he's beginning to allow the surrounding space to interpenetrate the figure. And that will lead eventually to the complete integration between figure and ground that you saw in Majoli. That is the first Cubist painting that I showed you. This is 1910. It's called Female Nude. Again, he's taking analytical cubism a little farther. So this involves space as well as time, folks. It's as if you were walking around the object, seeing it from various angles at the same time. Again, that is what he meant by simultaneity of viewpoint. At this stage, it's still possible to read the figure and to distinguish it from the surrounding space, but by the same token, as you can see, the space is beginning to be integrated intrinsically with the figure. And this is synthetic cubism. It's the one slide that I'm going to show you of this particular style. Once more, remember, if you would, that this is the second phase of cubism. Started around 1911, lasted for about a year or so. And as you can see here, this is collage. You can see a piece of wallpaper in the background, what we would call faux painting to define the area on the left. George Braque, by the way, made a living in doing what we would call faux painting, and he taught Picasso the technique, which he used quite readily here. There's a charcoal drawing at the lower right, a piece of newspaper, a musical score, and it's put all together in such a way, that is, it is synthesized in such a way as to take on the form of a natural object, that is, as you can see here, a guitar. So let me remind you that by the time he reached the end of the analytical cubist phase, as represented by Majoli, the first painting that you saw, he thought he had gone too far. He had violated his original intention to show the object as it really was rather than as it appeared to be. And so he therefore engaged in the second style of cubism, that is synthetic cubism. So folks, please do have an understanding of both of those phases, if you would please. And let me show you where Picasso went after cubism. You can see that he has returned to the figure here, but not in an unquestioning way. There's a sense of the grotesque. By the way, Picasso is very knowledgeable about art history, and he's alluding to some figures from art history. If you take a look at the reclining nude on the lower right, that's an odalisque. We talked about that when we discussed the Venetian Baroque a while back. She's holding a mirror. You might remember the importance of mirrors in Baroque art. The figure just to the left of the reclining nude figure, the one that is seated, is directly pulled out of the work of another French artist whose name was Ingres. Ingres was a neoclassical artist. He worked in the style of Jacques-Louis David. So this is an important painting. Perhaps some of you are familiar with it. It is entitled Guernica by Picasso. Again, it was done in 1937. And in order to understand it, you have to understand a little bit about what was going on in Spain at this point in time. And I did send you a film on Guernica. It's quite a good film. So if you haven't viewed it yet, I hope that you do have a chance to do that. But there was a civil war going on in Spain in 1937. And remember, if you would, that Picasso was a Spaniard, so this was his home country. And as many civil wars, it was fought between the forces of the right wing and the forces of the left wing. The right wing was led by Franco. He liked to call himself Generalissimo, that is, the Supreme General Franco. And he believed, probably rightly so, that a stronghold of left-wing political activity was in a small town called Guernica. So he contacted Adolf Hitler, his fellow fascist, who, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, was building up his military war machine. And Franco suggested to Hitler that he sent the Luftwaffe, that is the German Air Force, to Spain and bomb Guernica, which indeed Hitler did, and there was a horrific loss of life. As the film that I sent you mentions, most of the people who were killed were women and children, because most of the men were, in fact, fighting at the front. Picasso had been at work on a mural, and which would have been used in the World's Fair. And he completely abandoned the original conception, and he did this piece instead. It's a large work. It has been referred to as Picasso's enraged outcry against the political rape of Spain. What he's done here is taken the traditional symbols of the bullfight, that is obviously there's a bull on the left and the horse in the middle of the compositional configuration. And the horse is a victim, as you can see. It's been gored. The triangular compositional configuration in the center is comprised of horse and human figures who are also victims as well. The bull on the left is usually interpreted as being a reference to fascism, the aggression. Obviously, there's a dismembered body in the foreground, a woman holding a murdered child. If you're wondering if this is a black and white slide of a painting that was done in color, the answer is no. He did it, the expression is en grisaille, that is in tones of black and white and gray. So it's a really quite important piece. You can't call it Cubist, strictly speaking, in terms of the style. But I don't think that he would have produced this image in the manner that he did had he not gone through the Cubist phase. So let's go on and let me, pardon me, introduce you to Expressionism, which is a very important style, was a very important style in Germany, also in Austria as well. And you have the primary artist associated with Expressionism on your sheet. By the way, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner is one, Kater Kollwitz is another. We will also look briefly at the work of Franz Marc. Let me interject at this point the number that I will ask that you send me via email, which will be 595. So in order for me to get attendance, please do send me an email with your name and the number on the subject line, please. Okay, let's talk about Expressionism. Every time I teach it, I toss out what is pretty much of a simplistic cliche, but as so many cliches, it does have some validity. And that is that Expressionism is an art with a message. These people were interested in didacticism, that is teaching people something about what was wrong with the nature of society, particularly in reference to the work of these artists. And let me tell you a little bit about who they were. They actually began their careers not as painters, but as architecture students. And they decided instead that because they had to get involved with this business of an art with a message, that they would turn their attention to the fine arts instead. I'll tell you a little bit more about Die Brücke, or the bridge. Die Brücke is the German word for the bridge, in just a couple of minutes. But before we do that, I want to give you an overview of what was going on in Germany in terms of the cultural background at the time period. And I think it's safe to say that members of the German intelligentsia, that is the artists and the intellectuals, alternated between despair and then visions of the possibility of a universal sense of humanity. The despair came primarily in terms of the person who was in power at the time period, Kaiser, that is the Emperor Wilhelm, who really was very oppressive in many ways. Germans were at odds with each other. The socialists versus the middle class, the Protestants in the north versus the Catholics in the south. It was a very difficult time period. And one German expressionist poet said, in quotes, 1910 was the year that all the timbers started creaking. And of course, that's the end of the quote. Of course, they would eventually break open into World War I, which happened, as you know, from 1914 to 1918. On the other hand, they often talked about very idealistic visions of universal peace. The musician Schiller wrote, I believe in the Republic of the Future, which will embrace the entire earth. And Die Brücke, or the bridge, wrote this: putting our faith in a new generation of creators and art lovers, we call upon all youth to unite. We who possess the future shall create for ourselves a physical and spiritual freedom opposed to the values of the comfortably established older generation, end quote. That statement was written by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who is pretty much the undisputed leader of the bridge. But let me point out to you that in terms of style, what these artists did, all of them to one degree or another, was distort representational reality for the sake of portraying, of manifesting very intense emotions. And the themes that they were involved with were such as questions of identity, the relationship between man and woman, very often anti-war themes for that matter as well, primarily in the work of Kater Kollwitz, and to a lesser degree in that of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. Die Brücke, or the bridge, had several reasons for selecting this title. In one of the films that I sent to you, there's another interpretation, but what I have read several times, in fact, is that they, on the one hand, wanted to create a bridge to their subconscious. This was the time period of Sigmund Freud. Freud wrote Interpretation of Dreams in Vienna in 1900. Secondly, they said that they wanted to create a bridge to each other. In some ways, these artists, to some degree at least, realized the idealistic vision of Van Gogh in terms of establishing an artist commune. They did have a communal studio. They often would go on holiday, as Europeans would say, together. And finally, point three, they said that they wanted to construct a bridge to the general public. And this is obviously where the business of didacticism, that is teaching, comes into play. So let me show you a few other pieces done by Kirchner. This is a very important work of art, which is entitled Self-Portrait Artist and Model. That is he, obviously, on the left, and his model, whose real name was Doris. And I'll tell you in just a minute the nickname that he gave to her. It was done, we think, in 1907. And I say we think because Kirchner had the rather annoying, from the point of view of his colleagues, habit of when he signed a work, he would often include a date that was actually much earlier than the time that he had actually done it, in order to make it seem as if he was more innovative than he actually was. But in terms of the theme, what you have here is the theme of alienation, lack of communication, and more specifically, his comment on the relationship between the sexes. I should tell you that German Expressionism in general was a very, very sexist sort of style, both in its literature as well as in its visual arts as well. And Kirchner bought into the idea that for the good of society as well as individuals, man must dominate woman. And that's clearly what he's suggesting here. So his figure is obviously much larger than that of the figure of Doris, whose nickname, as given to her by Kirchner, was Dodo, and I think that pretty much summarizes it all. His figure is projected to the front of the picture plane. There's a very strong triangular configuration. He obviously occupies a good part of the space of the painting. She looks very timid, does she not? They're strongly divided from each other. There's roughly a vertical line dividing them. And folks, I don't think that you should consider the placement of that brush accidental. It's obviously very phallic. And I should tell you that German Expressionism was essentially an art done by men for a male audience, and very often about women, or as you can see in this particular case, the relationship between the sexes. There's one writer, and I like this interpretation, who looks at his robe and says that it looks very much like the stripes on the coat of a tiger. And it's pretty obvious in this painting that the nature of their relationship does go beyond the professional. He is just wearing a robe. She's wearing a negligee, as you can see. This is another painting by Kirchner. And at the time that he did this, they had left Dresden, which was the town where they lived and worked for a number of years, for the big city of Berlin. And he became very interested in the urban dynamics that he encountered there. And to some degree, that's what you see here. It's entitled Figures in the Street. Now, do you not agree that the two female figures on the left look to be perhaps more powerful, certainly, than did Doris in this particular piece? And they seem to be dominating the men, particularly the male figure on the far right. But I want to caution you, do not think for a second that Kirchner changed his attitude toward women and he began to agree that women should have a sense of power. Very far from it. What you see here is the so-called femme fatale, and that's French for the dangerous woman. That is a woman who is intelligent, who is self-possessed, who's confident, and she's going to cause a lot of trouble for any poor male who happens to confront her. So no, he did not change his attitude. This particular piece was in the Degenerate Art Exhibition, and let me tell you what that was. Adolf Hitler, as you might know, was a frustrated artist. Actually, he first wanted to become an architect, and he couldn't do that because architecture was and is, of course, taught at universities. And he did not have what Americans would refer to as a high school diploma, so he couldn't enter the university. He tried, therefore, to become an artist. He was turned down for lack of talent at an art school in Austria. And I don't know if you know this, but Hitler was not German, rather he was Austrian, ironically enough. But he continued to paint, and he fancied himself a very good painter. If you take a look at his paintings, they're horrible. Interestingly enough, his architectural renderings are quite good. So he did have some talent in that regard. But what I'm saying to you is he had something of an axe to grind about the art world. And he declared all of these avant-garde artists to be degenerate. And this painting was exhibited in an exhibition that was held in 1937, which was called the Degenerate Art Exhibition. And what the Nazis did is that they rounded up so much of this avant-garde art from public collections and eventually from private collections that were owned by Jewish families a little bit later on, and branded it degenerate, put it in this exhibition, ridiculed it in every way they possibly could. They jammed these paintings together, often without frames, scrawled graffiti around them, such as the defilement of German womanhood, the defilement of German Christianity, and did everything that they could to ridicule the works. Eventually, because they were obviously brutal but not entirely stupid, They sold many of these pieces at auction before the war broke out in Switzerland. Switzerland was and is a neutral country, as you probably know. But I bring up the degenerate art exhibition within the context of our consideration of this painting by Kirchner, because it was in the degenerate art show. And the Nazis changed the title of it. Kirchner had entitled it Self-Portrait as Soldier with Model, but they changed it to Soldier with Whore. You can see that he has portrayed himself as having had his right hand severed. That never happened to him. He never suffered a physical wound in World War I. He did suffer considerable mental and psychological nervous disorders, as well as did so many people of the so-called lost generation. But he has used this as a metaphor to suggest the pain, emotional and psychological, that was visited on the whole lost generation of World War I. If this looks familiar to you, and I hope that it does, it is in our collection, the DIA. Again, this is Kirchner's work. He, when it was possible to do so, left Germany and went to Switzerland, and he did a lot of alpine landscapes, this being, of course, one of them, as you can see here. It's very interesting because this painting was given by Kirchner personally to the man who was at that point in time the director of the museum. His name was Wilhelm Valentiner, and from everything I've read about him, he must have been a great scholar and a personal friend of many of the artists. And Kirchner gave him this painting on the occasion of Valentiner's birthday. And eventually Valentiner bequeathed it to the DIA, where you can see it now. Okay, let's go on to Käthe Kollwitz. And she is another German expressionist. I would ask that you put a check in front of her name as well. She's really quite an important artist. She was an independent, and given the attitude on the part of the German expressionists toward women in general, and women artists specifically, that should really not be surprising to us at all. Kollwitz had two major themes. I'm going to show you examples of both of them and ask that you have some understanding of this, please. You will probably meet up with it in terms of a question on the final exam. But her first major theme was the plight of the urban working poor, in Marxist terms, the proletariat. And by the way, in terms of her own politics, and this was true of many of the avant-garde artists of the time period we're talking about, she was pretty left-wing. She was essentially a socialist. She came by this sort of naturally in terms of the attitudes on the part of her own family. The second major theme had to do, pardon me, with the anti-war theme. And again, she came by this naturally as well. Kollwitz gave birth to two sons, and one of them was killed in World War I. So when she paints the anti-war theme, it's not done, I'm sorry, forget paint. That was a mistake. She is primarily a printmaker and a sculptor. But when she depicts the anti-war theme, it is from a very visceral point of view. That is, it is from her gut. It's not an abstract point of view at all. So again, those are the two major themes, the plight of the working poor and her anti-war theme. And by the way, she was married to a physician, and together they made the decision to live and work in a poor area of Berlin. He treated the poor people. She very often depicted them in her art. And every time I teach Kollwitz, I ask people to imagine the possibility of somehow going back in time and being in his waiting room in his clinic. And you might have seen Käthe Kollwitz there, perhaps talking with some of the members of the proletariat, perhaps asking them to pose for her. This is variously called the laborer's wife. Sometimes it's called woman with a blue shawl. But again, it's a very good example of this first major theme that she was concerned with, the plight of the urban working poor. So you have here a woman who is old before her time, literally and figuratively, if you will, weighted down by the difficulties of her life. This is a fairly early piece done by Kollwitz. Again, it is a print. As I said, she is primarily a printmaker. She also does sculpture as well. The title of it is Black Anna. Sometimes it's called the uprising. And I should tell you that Kollwitz was anything but an idealist. She was a realist to the point of being cynical. She believed that always in human history there would be the people with power and money who would control those people without power and money. And during various time periods, there would be uprisings, and the people would rise up against their oppressors, as you can see here. By the way, I have spent a lot of time trying to find out whether or not Black Anna, who apparently was a historical figure, was of African descent, and I have not been able to do so. It does look as if her arms are slightly darker, her right arm for that matter as well, but again, I've not been able to find out whether or not that was true. So these poor people will attempt to rise up against their oppressors, carrying really pitiful weapons. That's a scythe, I believe it's called. It's an agricultural tool carried by the man in the middle of the compositional configuration. There's a woman with a child on her back. But ultimately, according to Kater Kollwitz, they would be unsuccessful. And the whole cycle of the oppressed and the oppressors would continue throughout all of history. Okay, this is a very, very important piece, folks, so do put a check in front of it. It is called The Volunteers, and it was done in 1923. It is another print, as you can see here. And it is a very good piece by which to ask you to consider her second major theme, that is the anti-war theme. Now, I need to give you a little bit of background about what was going on in Germany at the point in time that this piece was done. Again, the date of it is 1923. Obviously, World War I was over, having ended in 1918. Germany was in economic chaos, in political chaos for that matter as well. And what had happened near the end of World War I, when Germany understood that it was all over for them and that the Allies would emerge victorious, is they put into place a quasi-democratic government because they believed that perhaps they would be treated a little bit more fairly by the victorious Allies. That government was called the Weimar Republic. And in fact, they were not treated well at all. And the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, demanded all kinds of things from Germany in terms of war reparations, and it made a lot of Germans angry. In the minds of many historians, World War I just quite simply led to World War II because Germany was so oppressed by the victorious Allies. So what I'm saying to you is that in 1923, by 1923, Germany was torn apart between two factions. And these factions were quite literally warring in the streets of German cities. On the one hand, there were the people who said, we have to stay the course. That is, we have to try to ensure that the Weimar Republic, this quasi-democratic government, does succeed. On the other hand, there were the people who said, no, we can't do that. We have to go back to war, because going back to war is the only way that Germany will be able to, as they put it, gain back their national pride. Obviously, those are the people that supported Hitler. Those are the people that eventually won out. And World War II, of course, broke out in Europe in 1939, as I'm sure you know. So you have to understand this piece as against that political landscape. Again, the title of the piece is called The Volunteers. And Kollwitz herself has written about this work. She wrote a diary, which was edited by her surviving son, by the way, and I've read it in the library of the DIA. But she's talked about the various figures that appear here. The figure on the far left, as you can see, is essentially a skull and crossbones beating on a drum. Functions on two levels. On the one hand, it represents death. Secondly, it represents the warmonger, you know, the person in the streets who's telling the young men of Germany that they have to go back to war in order to gain back their national pride. Death, aka the warmonger, is embracing a dead young man, as you can see. The figure in the center is dying. The third figure from the right, again, is dying as well. The two far right figures are supposed to represent the young men who are idealistically and naively following death in disguise as the warmonger, and that warmonger will lead them to their deaths. Now, I think you have to understand the title, The Volunteers, in an ironic sense. What she's saying here is that they are not really volunteers, but rather they have been hypnotized, they've been mesmerized into believing what the warmonger has to say. And I think that's the reason for what seems to be a compositional configuration which almost suggest a vortex, these curvilinear forms on the top part of the print, which are repeated in the inverse on the bottom. So again, they're not really volunteers. Check this piece if you would, please, folks. It's a really important work of art, The Volunteers, 1923 by Kollwitz. This is called The Parents, Mourning Parents. And this is a poster that she did. It's a lithograph, Nie wieder Krieg, which in German means never again war. If you take a look at the date down in the bottom, 1924, same basic era, pardon me, in which The Volunteers was done. Her last series was a series of death. Her husband had died by this point in time. Kollwitz herself died in 1945, just a matter of months before the armistice was signed to end World War II. I've always considered that to be a rather tragic end to her life, because she devoted so much of her time to trying to end war, and she didn't have the opportunity to see the end of World War II. And this is actually a self-portrait by Kollwitz. It's called The Call of Death. Okay, real quickly, and I'm not going to burden you with remembering the name of this artist, but I want to show you the work of Franz Marc, who was another German expressionist artist. He was associated with a school outside Munich that was called the Blue Rider. And he was involved, as were his colleagues, with attempting to pose a solution to the problem of society. Expressionists such as Kirchner and Kollwitz obviously showed us the problems of society. These people attempted to pose a solution, and that solution was a return to the spiritual and moving away from materialism. Franz Marc chose animals as his primary subject matter, especially horses and deer, as you can see here. This is called Large Blue Horses, because he believed that animals were pure spiritual beings, and they were not corrupted by that which we human beings like to call intelligence, which more often than not gets us into serious trouble. But he involved himself with color symbolism. Blue was the color of the spiritual. Red was the color of materialism. As you can see in this particular case, the blue is dominant over the red. So the suggestion is, in fact, that blue, or rather the spiritual, has conquered materialism. This was done a few years before the outbreak of World War I. This piece, which is called The Fate of the Animals, or Animal Destinies, was done just before the outbreak of World War I. And so you can see that which Franz Marc referred to as the inner mystical construction of the universe being torn apart. The blue deer in the center represents the spiritual being victimized by materialism. Remember, if you would, that red is the color of materialism. So those two intersecting diagonal forms suggest, in fact, materialism destroying the inner mystical construction of the universe and the spiritual world as well. This was the last major painting that Franz Marc did. He was killed in World War I at the Battle of Verdun. And he's beginning to approach, as you can see here, almost non-objectivity. Pardon me. Admittedly, the form at the left does seem to take on some semblance of the suggestion of a predatory bird-like form, perhaps an eagle descending on the figure at the right. Remember that materialism is defined in terms of color symbolism by red. Blue is the color of the spiritual. Violet, he said, is an expression of intolerable grief, and those are direct quotes. Violet, as you know, is a combination of blue and red. So it's as if what's going on here in this painting, which is a very important one, uh, entitled Battling Forms or Forms in Combat, depending on how you translate it from the German, is the suggestion that materialism has in fact destroyed the spiritual realms. Okay, we're going to go on to the next major style that we will talk about, and we will talk about it fairly briefly. I'm not going to burden you with remembering this particular style, which is called Futurism. And the artist who is the most important of the futurists is named Baccioni. The correct spelling of his name is on your syllabus. But Futurism was a brief but very intense collaboration of Italian artists from about 1909 to 1914. There was a next wave of Futurism as well. But their goal, as they articulated it, was, in quotes, the renewal of the human spirit through a new art and a new vision of the world. Their new vision of the world was a total acceptance of modern civilization and all its industrialization and technology. So the acceptance of the so-called machine aesthetic was a very important one for Baccioni and the other futurist painters. They wrote, "A race car is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace," quote unquote. The victory of Samothrace, you might know, was a Hellenistic Greek sculpture. It's sometimes called the winged Nike. It's very large, it's marble, it greets you as you walk in the main entrance of the Louvre. And their new vision of humanity had some pretty questionable new human ideals that they articulated in one of their manifestos, such as love of danger, fearlessness, rebellion, aggression, jingoism, scorn for women. If you don't know what jingoism is, it means patriotism to an extreme degree and the use of military force in order to realize patriotic values. And they made reference to a strong and healthy injustice of life. So these were really pretty dangerous guys, and it shouldn't surprise us that eventually in the second wave of futurism, they supported the fascist dictator in Italy, that is Mussolini. But in essence, futurism, as German Expressionism, was an art with a message. And the message that they promulgated, as I just said a few minutes ago, was the new modern society, which would have the machine as its primary emblem. Now, this is an early piece done by Baccioni, and he really has not achieved the formal elements yet that are going to allow him to reach his vision. But one of the things that they were primarily interested in was movement. So they talked about two different types of movement, that is relative movement, by which they meant the movement of an object from point A to point B. And because speed fragments the outlines of an object moving quickly in front of you, you should, according to Baccioni, if you're painting a horse, paint a horse with 20 legs as opposed to 4. The second type of movement that they investigated, they called absolute movement, which they expressed in the formula that absolute movement equals object plus environment, by which they meant everything had the potential for movement, sound waves, smells, everything, you name it. But the title of this particular piece, which, as I said, is a fairly early piece, done in 1910, is The City Rises. So if you take a look carefully, you will see workers in the lower part of the compositional configuration, a number of very large horses, draft horses, notably the one in the center, that blue form is supposed to be the horse's harness. And in the background, you see the modern metropolis, which is being built, smokestacks belching out smokes, everything to do with the modern world. Now, at this point, he has not discovered Cubism. And eventually, as you will see, Cubism gives him the formal vocabulary in order to realize his vision of movement. But at this point, he's looking at Impressionism in a style we didn't have time to talk about called Neo-Impressionism. And he's elongating the so-called pointillist dots. Pardon me, this is called The Street. And as you can see here, he has discovered Cubism. So he uses the formal vocabulary of Cubism, albeit he also uses color. And as you have seen from our discussion of Cubism, eventually analytical Cubism becomes monochromatic. Color is not a major expressive device for the Cubist painters, but it is, of course, for the Futurists as well. If you take a look carefully, you see the torso of a woman in the foreground. She's standing on a balcony. You can see a wrought iron balcony, the lower left of the compositional configuration. She's looking out in the street, and everything is in a state of flux. Everything is moving. This is absolute movement. This is also Baccioni, and the title of the piece is The Laugh. Once more, he's looking at Cubism. Now, it's obvious that there is only one figure, that is the large woman at the upper left, who has not been if you will, broken up in terms of the Cubist formal vocabulary. If you take a look carefully throughout this painting, you're going to see tabletops, you're going to see figures, you're going to see light. There's two human figures actually at the left of the large woman. So the theme behind this particular piece is the physical as well as the emotional effects of the laugh of this domineering woman on everybody and everything around her. So this is another example of what they referred to as absolute movement. And another really quite important painting done by Baccioni, it's called Farewells. And this is the center panel of a triptych. I'm sure you know that a triptych is a painting comprised of three separate panels. The central panel is always the most important of them. And it is, as you can see here, a locomotive which is coming in and bending in a way that obviously a train cannot do. It stops in the center, and that's the reason that the four numbers, 6943, are not fragmented. And people disembark. If you take a look at the lower right, you can see references to human figures, and they're leaving. So the panel on the right side of this particular piece was entitled Those Who Stay. And if you take a look at the lower left of this particular piece, you'll see more figures, and they're going off into the night. They're continuing their journey on the train. So that the panel to the left of this central figure was called Those Who Leave. They become more and more difficult to put together, as you can see here. But if you take a look carefully, you might be able to make out the form of a horse and rider. The horse is the very large red figure, as you can see. The rider wearing black boots, as you can see as well. At the upper right, again, symbols of the modern era, towers, smokestacks, etc. But what you have here is a suggestion of that which the futurists referred to as the new futurist Superman. There's a pun associated with this painting. It's called elasticity, but the new futurist Superman has horsepower that is electricity under his control. So I don't know how you perceive this piece. My focal point is essentially the rider's boots, and that's where my eye is drawn. And if you know anything about how to ride a horse, you will know that the way a rider will command a horse to move forward is by applying pressure on the horse's sides with his or her legs. So this is the futurist Superman. Again, they are so very difficult to put together in terms of references to something from the natural world. But the title of this particular piece is The Dynamism of the Soccer Player. So if you take a look at that angular form just to the left of center, that's supposed to be the leg, the right leg of the soccer player. The form above it is his arm. He's supposed to be falling on the ball. Someplace over on the right is his head. But do you see here how the Cubist formal vocabulary is very important for these futurist artists? And whether or not you like Cubism, or I like Cubism for that matter, is pretty much irrelevant. I don't like it. I think it's an overly cerebral art. But the fact is that it provided a formal vocabulary which was used by many different artists for many different purposes, the futurists being among them. And finally, this particular piece, also done by Baccioni. He was a sculptor as well as a painter. This piece is done, as you can see, in metal. Um, and it's called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. It is another representation of the new futurist Superman. If you take a look at his lower legs, you can see an example of relative movement. That is the movement of an object from point A to point B. So you can see where the leg was, where it is, and anticipate where it is going. Okay, that is the last image, folks. As always, if you have any questions about what we've done, please do email them to me. I will, as I said at the beginning of this class, send out to you quite soon the open book, open note exam so you can get started on it. We will review next week, but as I said much earlier in this session, it really would be best if you go back to the original class sessions for the material. And if you have not sent me your paper, would you please do so as soon as you can? And as always, do take care of yourselves. And I will talk with you soon.